Hey guys, this is Tyler here, and I'm going to talk to everyone here about the famous Brit John McAfee. Very well-known guy. He obviously founded the McAfee Corporation, which has became a multi-billion-dollar company and still exists today. And he's very well known, obviously, for many things. And while he's not a mgtow guy per se, I do think there's many lessons we can learn from him and what occurred with him in his life, and perhaps how you can apply that into your own life. Okay, John McAfee most likely committed suicide. He was about 75 years old, and this was just last week. We're talking late June here of 2021. He's been obviously very well known, as I mentioned before. In '07 was like the peak of his wealth at around $100 million. And then from that point, basically his life kind of went downhill, especially financially speaking. More recently, he was actually arrested in Spain over alleged U.S. tax evasion charges. The U.S. federal prosecutors also wanted to bring criminal and civil charges, alleging that he had failed to pay income taxes over a 4-year period. And then, like I said, on June 23rd, he was found suicided by hanging in Barcelona in his prison cell there because, as I said, they wanted to extradite him back to the U.S. Firstly, there's a lot of questions. Was it him who did it to himself, or was it someone else? Was this more like an Epstein situation? This is still uncertain to say at the moment. But what I can say is that no question, his having to go back to the U.S. definitely played a large role in him doing this or someone else doing this. And we obviously have seen, like with the Epstein situation, and also we saw like this kangaroo trial with Ross Ulbricht, famous for the Silk Road, who ended up getting multiple life sentences about 5 to 7 years ago, and certainly could also be the case for John McAfee. And I think it's important to note, though, that while his software company in more recent times wasn't the most well regarded compared to maybe some other competitors, this was one of the first type of software companies in this space ever to be founded. He was way ahead of his time, very revolutionary. And also, I think he saw the same situation too with like crypto and DeFi, and he was also a big proponent of this whole movement and understood just the importance of lessening the U.S. government involvement into the monetary system, all the problems of the Federal Reserve, and how DeFi and crypto could be a solution to so many problems. And I believe this is one of the main reasons the U.S. government was very angry with him, and they did not want him to be a big advocate and a leader in this space. And obviously, it was very well speculated that through both him and his wife that he could spend the rest of his life in prison. They could do the same thing as Ross Ulbricht and give him a life sentence, and he could be stuck in prison. Or try to have someone eliminate him while in prison. So it definitely made sense how distraught he was and the problems there. I think people though also, especially average guys in the West, should use this as an example to ask themselves if living in the States or in a Western country, especially if you become very influential in this type of area, is worth it. I mean, he obviously had fled the U.S. some years ago. He was living in Belize, and then he also, of course, lived in Spain, where he was apprehended. But something that he probably should have done, and I don't understand why. Maybe it was because he was still very patriotic to America. He obviously attempted to run for office as an independent or libertarian in 2020, which he only received a small percentage of the votes. But he should have probably considered renouncing citizenship. And I don't know if anyone had advised him, you might want to renounce your citizenship years back, because this was a huge liability. He was staunchly opposed to all kinds of income taxes. Obviously, he went many years without filing tax returns. And for a guy who is making this type of money, obviously he's going to be a huge target, especially too when he's very vocal. I mean, there's been other famous cases in history where people have gone years with, I have relatives who've gone many years over a space of time without paying income tax. But these were very average earning people, and a good amount of their money also they were earning in cash. Another example too is like Anthony Bourdain. People might be familiar with this guy. He also offed himself a few years back. There was a quote in one of his books, and basically he went many years without paying his taxes, probably 10 to 15 years during like the late 80s to early 2000s. And it wasn't until he started becoming more famous as a TV personality and his income started going up a lot more, he realized he'd have to get this situation dealt with. And that this is one of the problems. So like in McAfee's case, he was probably bringing in millions of dollars over those 4 years. And if, say, he was just bringing in a middle average income, probably wouldn't have had any issues, especially if he wasn't very vocal. But he was a big target. The U.S. government often uses this to weaponize and to go after people. It's also interesting too that like his dad had offed himself through suicide when he was 15 years old. In fact, John McAfee, I believe, if we go back to the 1980s, he had actually contemplated suicide way earlier in his life before starting the famous McAfee security software, antivirus software. And fortunately, I think when he got kind of on the right path, he started his company, and that kind of put his mind in a different space over that time. So this was certainly already a problem he most likely dealt with on and off over the years. It's also interesting that like in July of 2017, he had made some predictions about the price of Bitcoin. And I think he was actually calling it to be at 100,000 or 200,000 by like 2022. He was very accurate with his prices in his forecasts here. He, like I said, he very much understood the impact of DeFi and crypto and what it could do for people. Any guy though, like as I mentioned, if they're average or well above average, should look at him and use this as a reason to renounce citizenship if you're in a similar position, or if you don't agree with something. Because really, he was in a very optimal position to renounce his citizenship, but he elected not to. And like I said, I think a lot of it was due to his patriotism and just unwillingness to divorce himself from the U.S. This obviously probably would have saved him from going to prison, from having all these tax issues. The U.S. government also alleged that he was running a few ICO or crypto scams. Now, whether this is indeed true, I still don't know, but just note that U.S. government, the prosecutors like to throw kind of these different classic cases at these guys. Like, it's the same thing with the alleged sexual assault that he was also facing. Same example here. They often use this to try create a very negative opinion among the public. And so they do this. We also saw this, of course, with famous British guy Assange, who obviously spent many years in the Ecuadorian embassy in UK, and then eventually, just recently, he was obviously apprehended by UK authorities, and now he's sitting in prison. He could also be extradited to the US for these ridiculous crimes that he's been accused of by the US government. And the total sentence could be up to 170 years or so. Basically a life sentence, guaranteed life sentence in U.S. prison. And this is one of the problems though too, that we see that the U.S. just will extradite. They will pull someone from anywhere in the world, and even someone who's innocent. You gotta look at this. I've mentioned nomad capitalist Andrew Henderson. He's talked about understanding not just your present situation, but down the road. I mean, if you're philosophically against the taxes and all the crazy expenditures for the military-industrial complex, very liberal education system, against these old age public pension systems in the U.S., you have to remember here that you can be philosophically against something and do, say, not pay taxes or try start your own army or something. The U.S. government's not going to care. They're not going to care what your philosophy is. All they're going to care is that their demands are met. They're the biggest mafia in the world. The U.S. government's the biggest mafia in the world. Always remember that. There's just more and more proof of this, more evidence. And some of the activities that they legitimately engage in are basically the same as mafia. I mean, we've all heard about this guy, Barry Seal, very famous smuggler, drug smuggler during the 1980s, was making runs to Colombia, was working for both cartels down there, and then was also working with the U.S. government. He was basically working for both sides. And like this guy, basically, there's been a lot of research and people now seen this situation and suspect that like some of the intelligence agencies in the U.S. were profiting massively from this narcotic trade somehow. They were no question involved with this. And I suspect that when these agencies confiscate money, especially from big drug lords, they probably, I mean, a lot of this goes to their coffers. And they don't have to do all the dirty work that those guys have to do. They just simply throw people in prison and they collect the money. You have to remember that you're dealing with the big mafia now. And this is important to understand because a lot of like mgtow guys, of course, you can live to an extent in your own bubbles, like in whatever respective country you come from, but you also have to remember that you're living within the bigger system of that place, and that's just as important. Yeah, there are countries that he could have gone to where he, even if they did have taxes, he probably could have gotten away without paying them. But at the end of that day, physically one has to decide and make the hard choices, often sooner than later. If McAfee had renounced citizenship, which he probably could have many years ago, he would have, not his U.S. passport, would have been free of that system. Obviously, he didn't do that. And this is also why you need to think ahead, where you're probably going to be at in your life or where you see yourself being at, because as time goes on, you could have more problems of this type. And also as a big proponent of these, like the crypto and DeFi, just like Ross Ulbricht was, say, prime targeted by U.S. government, they obviously simply don't like these type of people. And that's another thing. If you're in the spotlight, it's in this type of area, you're going to be a big target by governments, and as this was the case. So John McAfee is quite a figure, and I think he'll be very well remembered and down the road for all he's accomplished and his legacy with cybersecurity and crypto, DeFi, among other areas. He's been quite a figure in this during his life. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.